Can COVID is an open science collective dedicated to rapidly mobilizing and sharing knowledge to help inform Canada's COVID-19 response. To learn more about us or how to join our community, you can visit our website at cancovid.ca.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of Can COVID Speaker Series. My name is Rosa Staltieri, and I lead the research and evaluations team here at Can COVID. And I have the pleasure of introducing to you to this week's speaker, Dr. Beate Sander, the Canada Research Chair in Economics of Infectious Diseases, as well as a scientist and director at the Population Health and Economics Research at the University Health Network. And our title for today is the Ontario Modeling Consensus Table, an overview of methods and current projections. So just a few items to note. We have saved time at the end of today's presentation for a Q&A session. So please do enter your questions into the events chat. And we have a brief announcement that we will share at the end. So without further ado, I will now hand over the mic virtually to Dr. Sander. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rosa, and thanks everyone for coming today. First day back after the long weekend, so welcome. I do want to speak a little bit about Ontario Modeling Consensus Table, kind of how we come up with the predictions that we do, but also kind of a general kind of evidence or generation of evidence, how it fits in with policy decision making during COVID-19. And so I want to start with this kind of like org chart that is for sure outdated, was already outdated when it was published, but I can't really find a new one. But I think what you can see on that right-hand side is just how complex decision-making is in general, and specifically in this pandemic situation where we kind of have high urgency in terms of when decisions have to be made, but also high level of uncertainty and many different things to cover. So there are all kind of tables and expert committees and advisory bodies and so on at the provincial level, but also at the national level, and then also at the local level and internationally. So a lot of stuff kind of going on. And so going back to maybe just think a minute of how we usually kind of generate evidence and how science usually fits into a policy making process, it's actually quite different. So traditionally, you would kind of say, like, outside of a pandemic, we would often contract out, or expert committees are kind of formed, and they review evidence that's been generated over a longer period of time in terms of research and publications, and they do systematic reviews. Or sometimes original kind of work is contracted out to one team, and then after a couple of months or years, however long the time frame is, they come back. So that doesn't obviously kind of really work very well in this pandemic situation. Like, again, I said, like, we need credible data, we need credible models that inform our policy, but at the same time, this all needs to happen very rapidly. And then we have this real problem of so much uncertainty. And so the uncertainty and the urgency kind of, it's reduced a bit over time. So we are no longer in March 2020, where we kind of knew very, very little and decisions had to be made super urgent. We know a whole lot more now. So a little bit the time frame changed and the evidence changed. But still, I think overall, it's kind of like this idea that, especially in terms of modeling, contracting out to one specific single center or group or academic group, wouldn't quite be appropriate in this setting, because we wouldn't have this kind of consensus, and usually one group would work with one set of assumptions and one set of data and so on. So it's not quite reflective of the challenges that we have with the pandemic. And so what we set up in Ontario is an alternative approach to kind of mobilize the scientific expertise. And so it's named, started kind of really ad hoc very quickly in March 2020. And so it's now named the Ontario's COVID-19 Modeling Consensus Table. So it's been around for about a year and a half. It's been matured in a lot of different ways. So it's a group of scientists, very broad expertise, mathematics, but also epidemiology, health services research, and others. there are healthcare practitioners, and there are decision makers, and there are colleagues from bureaucracy, like from the Ministry of Health as well. And other ministries also have colleagues from Ministry of Finance and other departments within the decision-making body. And there are some key considerations, or been some key considerations when we set up the modeling consensus table. So there's one of confidentiality, that what we discussed, so we use the Chatham House rules as confidential, what's happening at the table. We maintain very strict academic freedom. So each member has their academic freedom to pursue their research, or to kind of like whatever you want in a way. So maybe not quite whatever you want, but generally maintaining academic freedom to kind of publish and analyze and respond to different issues. One of the key things that the table set out to do was really to interpret all the different modeling estimates and kind of bring things together. And when we started in March 2020, every meeting kind of we talked about where do we think R is now, where is R going to be? Is R going to be greater or smaller than 1? And that kind of evolved into a way more complex modeling over time, and different types of discussions over time. So basically, core objectives, I see here on the right-hand side, we want to offer guidance, the best guidance to decision makers and our health system leaders. I want to leverage our latest knowledge, advances in techniques and different data sources. And I think that's where we have been pushing quite a bit in terms of analyzing data in different ways, building the models and providing forecasts and so on. And some of the work that we have done through the table actually moved to and was integrated in different types of dashboards for decision makers. So kind of also help the decision makers with specific research needs. And then kind of really leverage our collective expertise. So it's kind of amazing to have this multidisciplinary group and all stakeholders on one table. And so the modeling consensus table started first, and for those of Ontario who are more familiar with all the different structures, it did become a partner of the Science Advisory Table in summer last year. So once the Science Advisory Table was established, the modeling table became a partner of that table. So one of the key draws, at least initially for members, was, I think, other than kind of having this forum where you can share ideas and get feedback on your individual models and kind of discuss the data, was also access to data availability. So one key thing that was established with the modeling consensus table was access to a wide range of epi, clinical lab, health system, and public health through the Ministry of Health. So basically, all members of the table can access the data through a secure portal. And we already also have umbrella review from U of T's Research Ethics Board to use all that data. And that was, I would say, particularly important in the very beginning, when there wasn't a lot of data available that was kind of up to date. So we got the case, we could download those databases, and we can analyze this and use that data for a standalone kind of epi analysis. And there were a lot, and I will show some of the examples there, but also to inform all the models that we are building. So there are all those data sharing agreements in place. The only request was that whatever we analyze and whatever we use the data for, we can publish this and we can disseminate whichever way we want, but we do have to give 24-hour notice. So basically just telling the ministry, like, here's the paper that's going to be submitted. And so 24 hours later, it could be within the public domain. So basically giving a heads up. Of course, we don't get patient levels or all the data is analyzed before we get it. And I would say in the meantime, a lot of the data is more publicly available than it was in the beginning. So I think there is still a need for this type of data, but maybe a little bit less than it was in the early on. Just talking a little bit of the process for the modeling consensus table, and maybe in the discussions others may be able to jump in. I see there have been a couple of people, I think, on the call that are members of our modeling consensus table. So basically, generally, we do updates or we have done updates every 2 weeks, roughly, except over the summer where we took a break. But so during kind of the year, what we've done is like several teams, and usually it's 3 to 5 different groups, academic groups that have already developed models, and they run them for those specific updates and sometimes for specific questions. So over time, all those models have been presented to the modeling consensus table, like I say, often several times, where we kind of walk through those individual models and basically provide peer review. Pretty much all of them are also published in the peer-reviewed literature. Of course, not every version of it. Most often it's kind of more the original version when it was built, sometimes an update, but they get updated basically every 2 weeks for the most part. And so they cover all kind of different models. So there are several compartmental models. There's one model that's called the hurricane model. I can talk about that a little bit more maybe later. There are agent-based models. There are more simple forecasting models. And most of the models that we work are transmission models. Some also include outcomes like hospitalizations, ICU admissions, and deaths. Some predict mostly case counts. And then we have one specific model that's looking at the acute care system and patient flow specifically through that system. So that's kind of in general. And as we think about those usually bi-weekly updates, then we kind of get together. We meet every week anyway. So the modeling consensus table meets once a week. Where we discuss general, like kind of what's the current situation. Often we have guest speakers kind of bringing showing other models or kind of updates to the models we already have. Then also in those meetings, we kind of discuss kind of what's the situation, what may be coming up in terms of policy decisions, what are the type of scenarios, for example, like are we looking at substantially kind of rolling out vaccination? So that was kind of earlier in the year when we started to move from vaccinating high-risk groups to the general population. Is there, do we think there's going to be some kind of public health measures that would limit contacts, like all kind of scenarios that we probably could think through. But then the teams independently run their own models with their different assumptions, different approaches. I think one thing we do agree on, if we think we want to model some kind of public health measures that are restrictive, so some kind of lockdown, everyone kind of did like their own thing. Now we at least say, well, everyone starts like that lockdown, everyone assumes that lockdown starts in 5 days or something like that, so that we have at least the same timeline. But otherwise it's fairly independent. So the teams run the multiple scenarios. So usually each group runs at least 3 scenarios, often 5, sometimes even more than that. And then in our meeting, kind of come back together and talk about and review the different scenarios. Sometimes it's a smaller group, kind of depends on timing. Again, like the urgency is sometimes greater than other times, and the timing sometimes kind of works better or not as good with our regularly scheduled meetings. So sometimes it's a smaller group, but basically looking at the combined scenarios of all those different model runs. And then we put it together in some kind of in a draft slide set, and then it's presented also to the science advisory table for review and feedback before it kind of goes up to different presentations for different stakeholders and finally to the public. And I will talk about that process a little bit too. So that's kind of the regular thing. We also have specific questions that's kind of more emerging things, like when we had the first variant of concern. And usually it's scientists kind of picking up the topic, being interested in, and kind of running some models and kind of some different scenarios. And given that we have the scientists and decision makers in the same group, then it often kind of gets picked up and they go, oh yeah, that's interesting. or we talk about screening and testing, specific questions around vaccination rollout, and getting kind of those questions are often driven by scientists, sometimes also driven by the decision makers, or kind of, and then someone kind of picks it up and works on it, and kind of also makes its way often to briefings, including the public briefing. And I already mentioned that we often have weekly presentations by different guests, so other modelers, and I'm sure there are many on the call who have presented to the modeling consensus table on different aspects of maybe vaccine rollout or testing or other issues. Because we also have quite a lot of the data access to all the epi data, and we have members on the table who are epidemiologists, there were also quite a lot of kind of epi analysis, like how much more severe is that variant of concern, beta or delta, or whichever it is, questions like that. So we're having all the access to the data is really, really helpful. And then often that, again, feeds into the models in terms of input data. So we mentioned just a couple of quick examples, and I was started with, this is how it started. That was the very first briefing. I think at that time, nobody really knew what we were doing, but I think we knew what we were doing, but there was so much uncertainty. So at that time, we kind of looked just as best and worst case scenario, and I think was based on 2 models only at the time, because we haven't formally established the group, and it was looking at other trajectories. I think what I remember is the worst case was, what if things played out similarly to Italy? And I think that was the worst case scenario, sorry, and the best case scenario was South Korea, and then something in between, which I actually can't even remember now. Yeah, Korean experience and the Italy experience. And then the other briefings were kind of, so that's kind of what it usually looked like. So this was, I think, in early April. So it's kind of just at the beginning of the third wave in Ontario. I think at some point around that time, we started that little box kind of to show the range from the last briefing, mostly because there's so much concern around, oh, the models are kind of wrong. Except what we did usually show in terms of scenarios is looking at scenarios where there is no trigger for policy intervention. So, there are scenarios where maybe say in this one, the green line would mean we are having a lockdown for a specific period of time. Maybe other scenarios are without any type of lockdown, and then that's how it would look like. Of course, it never played out that way. So as cases and ICU occupancy went up, some kind of policy interventions would be done. And on top of that, usually as cases go up and ICU occupancy starts increasing, people also kind of pull back and reduce the number of contacts. And that's the last briefing. I will talk a little bit more about that one. So you see it looks a tiny bit different, but not too much. So that's from September 1st. So this is kind of how it looks like initially. So it's like I said, we kind of have 3 to 5 different teams running 3 to 5 scenarios each. We also have a counterfactual scenario in there. That's the red line. What if we had no vaccine? How would Delta have played out in Ontario? And so what we were able to show here is that without vaccine, basically we would probably have been already in a lockdown by early July. But so kind of moving onwards from where we are now, so this was done towards the end of August, so we see all those different scenarios. I'm also plotting usually those kind of dotted lines, which are just plain increases in case numbers. So kind of looking at a 3, 5, 10% increase in daily cases, which relates better to the kind of the data we have right now. So we know we had like maybe 4% increase. So we'd be roughly on that middle line. And so we test this kind of stuff we discuss. You see, they don't all connect perfectly well to the 7-day average, which is kind of the gray line. They depending on how the models are calibrated. So at some point they may be above or below that 7-day line, but generally kind of moving forward. So you see quite a range And then we kind of pick a range that represents those figures. And in the older versions until now, we would just pick 3 specific scenarios. What we have done now, because it's kind of really is a range, we just pick kind of like 2 lines that would represent that range. And that's what we did for last week's briefing. So where we have kind of that top red line, which means it's the upper range of the different scenarios, and similar to what if transmission increased by 25%. The green line is kind of more on the lower end of those different scenarios that you've just seen, and reflecting kind of what if we decrease transmission by 25%. The gray line here is a 4% increase in daily case count. So that's kind of just to show where we are kind of sitting right now. So that's when we did the modeling end of August. I think the 4% still roughly holds. So you kind of know where we are at right now. So this was obviously that great trajectory without going back to work and school and university in September, because that's the trajectory we were on end of August. So you think if we add more context, we would move towards the red line. If we were to kind of have some kind of public health measures that reduce context substantially, then we would probably be able to move towards that green line. So that's basically kind of what ends up in the public briefing eventually. And then we also run that through the healthcare model, kind of looking at ICU admissions. And so, we are probably kind of at least somewhere on that middle trajectory, potentially moving more towards that red line if there is no reduction in context coming, at the same time as we increase context through going back to work and school, etc. So we would expect something that is close to the third wave, at least, if not greater, depending on what the policy implementation or the policy measures would be. I know we are kind of running out of time, and I have a couple more slides, but because this seemed to be the kind of important thing for the talk today, I think I will pretty much stop here, because those ones you have seen they are publicly available on the Science Advisory Table website. This is another slide. So this is kind of just to wrap this up. This is from one model. And so we kind of have it like a supplement to the other projections, mostly to show kind of what the age distribution is, and that there is a shift in terms of age for cases as well as for ICU admissions. And I think I actually really will stop here, but I'm happy to share all the slides. So they had some more examples, and maybe some of the stuff will come up in the discussion, so I may refer to that. So I had some more examples of other modeling that's been, that has informed policy so far. And I think, Rosa, you managed the questions, right?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Sander. Great presentation, and we have lots of questions. So I'll start with the first one. It's around data on long COVID in Ontario. Someone's having little success in finding that. So how is long COVID being defined, tracked, etc.?
I'm honestly not sure. So we don't have specific long COVID data outside of what clinical studies that are ongoing. So the clinical studies that collects this type of data, CANCOV is the major one. I think then otherwise we can use, for example, health administrative data or electronic medical records to study long COVID, and there are several teams working on that, including ours. I think one of the challenges is that there hasn't been a fully established definition for what long COVID actually is. So it's coming, but there is no such thing at this point of time as a long COVID database where all that data would be in it.
Thank you. And so our next question is, aside from vaccine passports, which are intended to boost vaccinations, how can public health reach out to the remaining unvaccinated groups who are not encouraged to get vaccinated despite the mandate?
You think that would be a question from public health. I think there are many. I mean, I know the vaccine passports are here now. There are vaccine mandates as well for different groups and different employers are implementing vaccine mandates. And I know there is a lot of work going on with, and there may be many colleagues actually on the call that can probably answer that question much more in terms of outreach. So that for sure is going on as well. But I'm probably not the right person, I think, to answer that question.
And so our next one is the provincial dashboard's historical data archived anywhere for reference or review?
The provincial dashboard, I'm not sure. So I think you refer to the website that's run by the Ministry of Health. I'm not sure in terms of archiving. I know that there are data sets that you can download, so that on that same website there is a link to, and so that would be part of the archiving, right? So where I think number of cases per day and like all the kind of information that they have on there, I think is accessible in terms of tables, and some directly on the website, some through another link to a different data set to download. I'm not sure that fully answers the question because I'm not sure which dashboard exactly you're referring to, but so that's all I can say about the Ministry of Health website.
Thanks so much. And Tim Defoe, if you want to just clarify, please feel free to just type that into the chat box. We can get back to it later. So the next one we have here is you describe a partnership between decision makers and teams of university-based modelers. How does the model deal with conflicting or different results from different modeling exercises and different interpretation of the results? And thank you so much for this presentation.
Yeah, I think so. So a lot of that gets kind of covered in the discussion. I'd say I'm not sure if others really want to jump in here. I don't know if they can actually, but I think David is here and others. But I think a lot of like kind of how we look at the data, how we interpret the data is covered in our kind of general modeling consensus table meetings. What I should say is like why, one thing that stands out to me for that particular table is just how informal it is. And how I think we all have kind of warmed up to it. So it was a bit more, a bit more formal in the beginning. But I think now because it's also on Zoom, like people just open their screens and just share stuff that they're working on right now. So it's never really, unless a guest, I think our own presentations are never polished. They're always kind of very rough ideas and kind of this, share the screen, look at this thing, what do people think, like to kind of get feedback. So a lot of that is covered in that. And that's where it's also so helpful to have the epidemiologists, the people from public health who actually really understands also how all the data is collected. I think that was one of the pieces that was really important. Like kind of we had that portal, we had access to a lot of data, but as a scientist, you don't always kind of know how it's actually collected and what it all means. So having people that are involved in that part of the team was great. And then, of course, it's great to actually have a range and have people kind of interpret things a little bit different, because that's actually what gives us that range across the different models. So there are some key things where you say, well, we want to make sure we interpret the data correctly in terms of how it was collected and how we use it. But then there's always so much uncertainty. And so everyone can have their own thoughts in kind of how you look at it and that kind of, and how they use the data. And that's kind of part of the range and the benefit of having 3 to 5 or even more models with different scenarios and getting that range and discussing it and coming up with that consensus.
Thanks so much. And we just have a couple of minutes here. We'll get as much questions in as possible. So the next one is, I'm told for Ontario, the proportion of records with missing occupational data is over 90%, which makes analysis and comparison difficult. What efforts had the modeling table made to get, analyze, and communicate occupational patterns and resulting modeling implications?
So I think I would frame this more general. I think there are data elements that are missing from the data collection entirely. And so there's been efforts by the modeling team and say, this would be good for us to have. I think there are other things where there is actually a field and where we have very little, I would say, have little impact in how that's changed. So mostly that has to do with data entry and the public health units that have to enter all that data, and where there are fields that are absolutely required, otherwise that have to be filled in, and there are fields that are optional. And so kind of depending on their workload, they may or may not be able to do that, and they may or may not know that either. So I think those are things where we say, well, yes, it would be great for us, but where we have very little impact, and others, like that, like where we have more impact. I mean, some of the data that we were pushing for very hardly, for example, is critical care data, because we didn't have a good understanding of that. So there are different data elements where we kind of provide that feedback. And again, it's kind of great to have all the different players sitting at a table that can help make it happen. Doesn't mean it will happen, obviously, but we will try.
Great, and I'll just squeeze in this last one because it's in regards to one of the slides. For the last slide on 70% versus 80% pre-COVID contact rates, is this based on contact rates across all age groups, or is it for specific age groups, or perhaps vaccinated versus unvaccinated individuals? And then, yeah.
Yeah, so first to this slide, so it is across age groups, but prior to September, so prior to going back to school. So starting school, starting universities will increase contacts particularly among those age groups, like kids and students. But otherwise, it's across age groups and vaccinated and unvaccinated, except that, so I should also say, actually, there is, we have two population groups in there. So people that are more compliant with social distancing measures and mask wearing and everything else, and groups that are less compliant. And so once people are vaccinated, we assume they would have some wearing the mask maybe less often because they are vaccinated. So there are a lot of assumptions that also go into this, but generally it's across the population. Actually, the preprint is out, and I'm happy to share that after the call.
That's great. Thanks so much, Dr. Sander. I'm going to end the session here. So just want to say thanks so much on behalf of the CAN-COVID team for sharing with us the overview of the Ontario Modeling Consensus Table. And of course, thanks to our attendees as well. And just a brief note, next week's speaker series is on Tuesday from 4 to 4:30 Eastern Daylight Time, where we will hear from Dr. Sonia Anand, the Associate Chair of Equity and Diversity at the Department of Medicine at Astor University. And she's also the Canada Research Chair in Ethics, Diversity, and Cardiovascular Disease. And the topic of this presentation is understanding the COVID-19 risk, vaccine confidence, and immunogenicity in the South Asian population in Canada. So details about our events are on our website and will be included in this week's newsletter. So be sure to subscribe to our weekly newsletter if you haven't already done so you can stay up to date with our events and other initiatives. So this concludes today's event. Thank you so much again for joining us, and we'll see you guys all next week. Thanks again, Dr. Sanders.
Thanks so much, everyone.
We would like to thank our speakers and members of our network for their continued support and participation in Canada's pandemic response. If you are interested in learning more about CAN-COVID or joining our Pan-Canadian COVID-19 Research Network, please visit our website at www.cancovid.ca.